Aled Williams, and have the pleasure to introduce the talk by Robert Fletcher. So this is an event which is a joint event from the ConLab program at CMI and also the Conflict Enclosures project. So the talk is Biodiversity Conservation Beyond Market-Based Instruments, and I think it's safe to say that mainstream conservation approaches have faced profound social justice and equity challenges in recent years. And just a couple of examples of that are that during the Biden administration, there was a U.S. House Committee, U.S. House Committee on Natural Resources hearing on human rights violations in international conservation, in which a bipartisan committee asked many questions about how human rights violations were allowed to occur in international conservation efforts, including some household names in terms of conservation organizations. But also the values and the benefits of conservation are not being equally distributed. And my own research in Indonesia has shown that very little money from conservation programming results in benefits for local communities, indigenous peoples' organizations. And of course, this is a major problem if those who are actually enacting conservation values and are engaged in conservation work are not actually being supported in doing that. So it is with great pleasure that we were able to have Professor Robert Fletcher here from University of Wageningen to talk about a new approach to conservation, and we'll hear some more from him in a moment. So Rob Fletcher is an environmental anthropologist with research interests in conservation, development, ecotourism, globalization, climate change, social and resistance movements, and non-state forms of governance. He uses a political ecology approach to explore how culturally specific understandings of human, non-human relations and political economic structures intersect to inform patterns of natural resource use and conflict. And most of his research has been conducted in Latin America, particularly Costa Rica and Chile, but also in East Africa. So the structure of the session today, we have an hour. So after I stop speaking, Rob, please come up here and use the mic so that the colleagues and participants online can hear us. And I understand you'll speak for around 30 minutes with a presentation. And then we would like to invite for Q&A, also from you in the room. So please think about questions that you have, things that you would like to ask Rob about. And also we'll invite some questions via the chat from the online participants. So thanks very much, and Rob, please, podium's yours.
Well, thanks so much for that introduction and for the invitation to be here. And thank you to all of you for taking your valuable time this afternoon and coming to participate in this discussion. For me, this is very much a work in progress. It's a kind of new approach, but also some practical work that we've just started getting involved in. And this evolved out of my research over the last 2 decades as part of an international group of researchers who've done kind of a critical analysis of the social impacts of conservation. And a lot of the things that we're focused on were attempts to try to use conservation directly as an income generating source. The things we call market-based instruments. And I'll get into a bit of a background there. When we started presenting our critical work in various places, people would always ask, what's your alternative, right? What's your alternative? We didn't have a good answer from that. And so this, in a sense, is now our attempt to come up with an alternative and to actually start trying to put it into practice, which is a bit of a disconcerting kind of switch. It's much easier to sit back and criticize what other people are failing to do in the world than it is to actually get your feet dirty and do it yourself. The real world is quite messy, but now we're moving towards that next phase. So we'll talk about what we're trying to do in that respect, but also some of the challenges and still kind of open questions. And really looking forward to discussing this with you and getting a bit of your feedback. Right? So as a bit of a background, just in case you're not a conservation scholar, right? This is, of course, a classic image of conservation space, right? And what you don't see in this space is people, right? And this was, in a sense, the attempt of a lot of original conservation actions, is to create spaces that were devoid of people, and that at least had the appearance of always having been devoid of people, right? Preserving wilderness. But of course, this is a shot from Yosemite, and this, like most conservation spaces around the world, used to be filled with inhuman inhabitants who had to be removed in order for conservation spaces to function, right? And so what you end up having then, in most cases, is conservation spaces that are surrounded by groups of people who are understandably upset about the fact that they've been kicked out of spaces they previously had access to and don't have access to those resources anymore. Right? So as a result, over time, conservation has had to really reckon with the fact that there's people around conservation spaces, and a lot of conservation authorities who would prefer to just interact with the plants and animals within a space have had to become, in a sense, kind of managers of people and human development as well. Okay. So this is the way, at least, the environmental organization World Wildlife Fund kind of charts the development of conservation. Right. So you can see up here on paradigm 1 is this kind of classic approach that we often call fortress conservation, right? The idea of creating a reserve in which people are excluded except as visitors, right? And trying to keep them from encroaching on resources through a system of fences and fines, right? But of course, then what you have is communities living around the conservation space who are often, again, are upset about the fact they've been deprived from resources and aren't necessarily benefiting, from the fact that these spaces are being created, tourists are coming in and going out, right? So this has been widely recognized as an essential problem, and there's been, over the last several decades, attempt to so-called integrate conservation and development. Right, and that led to the development of the second paradigm, where the idea is, in this case, you still have your core reserve, right, in which people don't live, but now you've expanded your conservation area by creating a buffer zone around it, okay? In which sometimes communities live, sometimes they live outside of it, but the idea is you try to use the resources within that buffer zone, and sometimes in your core reserve, as a basis for income-generating activities, right? And that's where this suite of so-called market-based instrument comes in, right? How is it that you turn conserved resources into the basis of economic development, right? For the most part, it's usually the opposite. You take resources, you extract them, you turn them into commodities, and that's how value is generated, right? Conservation, and especially the suite of market-based instruments, are trying to do exactly the opposite, non-consumptive use of resources as a basis of income generation, okay? And so then we're talking about things like ecotourism, right? Very widespread in conservation practice, payment for environmental services program, where landowners are paid for supposedly the environmental services, clean air, clean water, and those kinds of things that their forests provide. The reduced emissions through avoided deforestation and land degradation, the REDD+ mechanism, and a suite of other kind of creative approaches, wetlands banking, biodiversity banking, right, species banking, all of these other kind of suite of attempts to really creatively try to harness the value of non-used resources. Okay, and so this really developed in this paradigm 2. And became even more kind of intense within this paradigm 3 that the conservation community has really evolved in, especially over the last decade, right? Directly linking conservation and community benefits, and trying then to use all of the biodiversity that your protected area contains as a basis for income generating activities, okay? And so our analysis suggests that over time, this kind of paradigm 2 has kind of fallen away, right? Kind of morphed into paradigm 3. And really what we see in most kind of mainstream conservation efforts is a combination of paradigm 1 and paradigm 3, right? The simultaneous protection and enforcement of an expanded series of conservation spaces conjoined with an expanded attempt to try to develop income for communities living around these conservation spaces through promotion of market-based instruments, okay? So this has been going on for a long time. It continues to go on, okay? And in addition to some positive effects this has had in terms of protecting species and providing income to communities, it's also had an increasing negative range of implications, right? What we've seen in terms of the enforcement of protected areas is an increasing militarization, right, of conservation areas in many spaces, the equipment and training of military personnel in order to enforce conservation spaces from encroachment by poachers, right, and other people trying to gain access to resources. This is particularly intense in sub-Saharan Africa, but in other places as well. Okay. And on the other hand, in relation to market-based instruments, there's also an increasing kind of array of social justice issues and human rights issues that go along with these spaces as well, right? Because once you create value in a space, then there's a lot of incentive to harness that value, right? And often then the very people who are supposed to then benefit from linking income to conservation are excluded from these benefits, right? When other actors want to control that value, right? So a form of dynamic that we often call green grabbing, right, takes place in these areas. Okay. And then in addition, just in kind of pure practical terms, right, what we've seen over time is this attempt really to generate income from non-consumptive use of resources has really not proved very successful, right, and in many cases has failed miserably. And there's some very kind of prominent examples of this in recent years. You're probably familiar, a couple years ago, The Guardian came out with the expose of the voluntary carbon market, which basically argued that at least 90%, right, of carbon offset projects that were focused on within this market were basically worthless, right, and didn't produce any value. Okay. And this is true, I think, of a wider range of projects as well. So this has really kind of thrown the whole kind of approach in industry into crisis, right? And other people say, well, it's just about how you actually measure this and how you enforce it. We just need to get those things right, right? For other people, it signals, and I'm one of these, a fundamental failure of this approach, right? And one of the potential implications is this, right? That the basic economics of these kind of programs was flawed and hadn't really been thought through, right? Because what you're essentially trying to do through market-based instruments is attach more value to conservation, right, than you could potentially get through resource extraction, for instance, timber, mining, and those things. But those things are incredibly lucrative, right? And they have a clear market for them. There's very little actual market for conservation other than through ecotourism, which is really just a drop in the bucket, right? So there's really never a sense of how so much value was going to be generated through these market-based instruments that they could, on pure market terms, outcompete extraction. And I think what we're really seeing is that playing out, that the basic economics are really not there, right? So in practical terms, there's, I think, fundamental questions about the viability of this approach, right? And then also in philosophical terms, right, this idea that what will be valued is what is economically lucrative, right, has its own issues, right, as this political cartoon kind of puts into perspective, right? And there's been some implications of this already. There's studies, for instance, that show that tourists are more interested in looking at colorful birds than blackbirds, right? And consequently, more conservation resources should go into protecting colored birds, right, than blackbirds, right? So you can potentially shape your conservation priorities. They follow from the economics as opposed to, the priorities for conservation from an ecosystem perspective, right? So there's also some interesting kind of philosophical implications of kind of following the market logic as a basis for your policy making that are also potentially problematic. Right. But again, the question in all of this becomes, what's your alternative, right? And so in recognizing a lot of these kind of issues, over the past several years, a group of us have kind of come together and said, well, if these are all the problems that exist with kind of mainstream conservation approaches, then what would kind of the opposite look like, right? And based on that, we've developed this idea of convivial conservation that we really kind of outline, me and my collaborator, Bram Boucher, in this book that we call The Conservation Revolution, but also some other work that you can find online. We have a website, okay? And really suggested that a new and potentially more productive approach to doing conservation would be organized around a different set of principles, at the core of which, for simplicity's sake, we'll reduce to these three following, okay? So traditionally, conservation has been about creating spaces that try to separate humans from nature to the greatest extent possible, okay? And what we're suggesting then is instead the creation of integrated species in which humans and other species coexist. And this kind of emphasis on coexistence is becoming an increasing focus of conservation activities, right? The second has to do in terms of governance, right? Rather than spaces being kind of enforced top-down by states, right? Having arrangements that really integrate local people who are directly affected by conservation based on direct democratic and equitable principles. It needs to be foregrounded. And third, and this is the thing that I really want to focus on in the remainder of this talk, is financing, okay? Rather than trying to finance conservation through market-based engagement, which I think has these fundamental issues that we talked about, trying to find alternative mechanisms that are based on redistributing the funds that already exist, as opposed to encouraging more market growth is the issue. But what does this actually look like? Okay? And this is where this approach of conservation basic income that we're developing comes from. Okay? And one of the sources of inspiration for this approach has been through our analysis of the way in which some market-based instruments actually function in practice, right? And it started with an analysis of payment for environmental services programs. Before moving to the Netherlands 10 years ago, I lived and worked in Costa Rica for 6 years, and one of the main things that I studied there was the payment for environmental services program they have. It's a nationwide program. It's been running for several decades now. It's usually considered a really good example of best practice for doing PES all around the world. Okay? And initially this program was brought in around the turn of the 21st century as part of a suite of structural adjustment policies after Costa Rica had a debt crisis. So it was very much a part of kind of neoliberal restructuring and was explicitly envisioned as a new market, right, for trade in environmental services, right? So to illustrate this, here's an assessment of the program that was done by the German government right after the program was developed, and said very explicitly, this represents a very important step forward in the management of forest resources away from deficit-plagued, subsidized operations that are only able to survive with the aid of state alms and towards a form of profitable, competitive land use based on sound business principles. Okay? So very much a market-based instrument. Okay? But a couple decades later, when I was doing my research, we were looking around and we started wondering, where's this so-called market that exists, right? And what we found was at that point, only about 1% of the money that was put in the system was actually generated through buying and selling carbon credits and other things through market transactions. And the vast majority of the program was funded through state taxes on fossil fuel use, and also grants and loans from the World Bank, from the Global Environmental Facility, and bilateral funding from Norway and Germany, right? So there's very little market in this supposed program, right? So the idea was this was supposed to move away from subsidies on the basis of state alms, but in fact it functioned as exactly the thing that it was supposed to be the opposite of, right? So we thought this was kind of compelling. We hadn't seen this in the literature before, so we published this article asking this compelling question: is this really a market-based instrument, or is this in fact a subsidy in disguise? Okay? And what we found then is at the same time, other people had started publishing similar analysis of payment for environmental services programs in other places that were coming into the exact same conclusion. So here's a program in Cambodia that's described as a market masquerade, and another one also published in the same year about Vietnam that asks that same kind of question, right? Is this really a market at all? Okay. So other people started doing more meta-analysis of PES all around the world, and they basically came to the conclusion that most PES programs have very little market at all, right? And in fact, they function as these kind of subsidy programs. Okay, so in 2015, this kind of meta-analysis came to this conclusion: a very large fraction of transactions between public intermediaries and providers do not take the form of trade, but are best characterized as subsidies. We can therefore conclude that a substantial part of PES is non-market. Right. So you have something that seems like it functions as a market, but in fact functions as exactly the opposite. Right. And it turns out that other MBIs also function in the same way. So a similar analysis has been done about Red Plus programs that also shows that there's very little actual market transaction in most of these programs. For the most part, they're just a form of development aid. Okay? So this is part of our inspiration of saying, well, what if we took the actual logic for how these programs work, right, as, in a sense, a subsidy for rural livelihoods, and build something based on that logic, as opposed to the ostensive market logic that, in fact, is not actually part of these programs, right? So that was part of our inspiration, right? The other part of our inspiration was looking at the world of international development that was kind of going through what has been called this kind of profound revolution, okay, around the implementation of so-called cash transfer programs, okay? So this was, at least in the 1990s when it was first introduced, a new approach to doing development, right? Traditionally what development does is outside actors come in, help decide for local people what kind of new projects will benefit them, provide seed money to develop those programs, to help them develop new forms of businesses that then they can use to generate income. Right? Cash transfer programs tries to get all around this by just giving money directly to people in need, and then allowing them with various degrees of conditionality to choose what they spend their resources on. Right? And what was interesting was originally these programs started developing underneath kind of the shadows of the mainstream development institutions, right? So the World Bank was initially very, very skeptical of these kinds of approaches. They started coming up in Brazil and Mexico, and gradually evidence kind of built up that there was a lot of kind of success in these programs, to the point that organizations like the World Bank changed their perspective and started getting on board with this and started promoting them in different forms, right? To the extent that World Bank documented a couple years ago that programs that do cash transfer of some type exist in at least 130 countries worldwide, supporting at least 720 million people, right? This is a very, very kind of widespread program, right? And at least for proponents of this program, they think it demonstrates a lot of success, right? In a profoundly different approach than traditional development projects, okay? But there's a bit of complexity in terms of this, because not all cash transfer programs are created equally, okay? A common distinction is between programs that are conditional and unconditional, right? The idea with conditional programs is that recipients aren't free entirely to choose what they spend their money on, or that receipt of their money is usually tied to some type of condition. For instance, sending your children to school, or getting regular health checkups and that kind of thing. A bit of conditionality. Versus unconditional programs in which you're free to do with your money whatever you want to, okay? So there's many more conditional programs that exist in the world than unconditional, and that's partially due to the fact that organizations like the World Bank that do support conditional programs are much more in favor of conditional programs than unconditional, right? Because there's a lot of skepticism that people will choose to use their money in productive, efficient ways if you don't attach conditionality to it, right? And that's despite the fact that the overwhelming evidence kind of shows that outcomes of unconditional programs are still very similar to programs of conditional that are also conditional, right? And this is one of the things that the group of researchers that study cash transfers are really kind of scratching their heads about, right? And they're kind of frustrated about this. They're saying we can produce as much evidence as we want to, right? That unconditional programs actually do work, and still there's this kind of innate skepticism of these kind of programs. There's this kind of basic suspicion that if people are just given money and not kind of told what to do with the money, that they'll buy alcohol and sit around and drink themselves to death, right, as a stereotype. And that's something that it seems no amount of evidence can really kind of counter, all right? There's also the question of just how kind of different cash transfer programs are from kind of mainstream and especially neoliberal forms of development. There's kind of debates within the academic discussion about this as well. For instance, people have suggested that cash transfer programs that are conditional, at least, you know, even though they give money to people, still kind of operate very much within a kind of neoliberal logic. So here's a kind of critique of this that suggests that conditional cash transfers are in fact the social policies naturally associated with neoliberalism, right? Even though they assist the target group at the margin, they are by design insufficient to transform the economic, social, and political structures, perpetuating poverty, okay? On the other hand, there's been a suggestion that unconditional programs are much more kind of transformative, precisely because of their lack of conditionality, right? So another analysis suggests this, right? The reason why World Bank and other organizations are so suspicious of unconditional cash transfers is because they are anathema to neoliberal policymakers, precisely due to their redistributive element, that they actually transform things a bit on their head, okay? But that's a bit of the kind of discussion around the impact, but also the nature of cash transfer programs, right? But a lot of this work around cash transfer programs has been the inspiration for an expanded discussion around the idea of universal basic income, which I'm sure all of you have heard of because it's really kind of exploded on the scene, especially within the last decade and the last couple of years. It's been promoted by candidates for the U.S. President, an explosion of literature, right, that this is just kind of a subset of this, right? The idea that we can actually build on this kind of principle of cash transfer to essentially provide a basic income floor for everybody throughout all societies all around the world, okay? So what is universal basic income, all right? Well, the list of conditions to actually fulfill this kind of ideal are quite extensive, right? First, of course, it must be universal. Everybody gets this, with the idea that even wealthy people get this basic income, and then the money they receive comes back again through taxation, right? From this perspective, it must be individual, not given at the community or household level, right? It must be basic in the sense that it covers people's basic needs and allows them to survive, but not necessarily to thrive, so that if you actually want more income, then you still have to get a wage job, right? Part of this is that it should be unconditional, no conditionality attached to it. It should be regular, it should be predictable, it should be stable, and it should be permanent and non-withdrawable. All right? So all of these conditions are difficult to fulfill, right? And there's been a lot of kind of basic income trials or pilot projects, right, that simulate some of this to a certain degree, but don't really fulfill all of these requirements, right? Because if you have like a temporary program that's being given, then these last parts, stable, permanent, non-withdrawable, right, are not being fulfilled, right? So only a program that continues indefinitely would fulfill this. And few programs are actually universal in the sense kind of society-wide, because it takes a huge amount of resources, right? But there's been a lot of kind of partial basic income pilot projects and a growing body of research that's basically called basic income studies that documents this and shows that there's a lot of success and a lot less kind of free riding or people kind of using their resources in unproductive ways, a lot less than a lot of people suspect, right? A growing range of programs are being tried. Cities throughout the U.S. are implementing pilot projects in many other places as well. Okay? So this was another piece of the inspiration for our thinking about developing a alternative conservation funding mechanism based on different principles, right? But in the same way that there's kind of debate about how radical cash transfer programs are, there's also debate about how radical universal basic income is, okay? And that's partially because this is a policy platform that has, over time, been promoted by people in a wide variety of the spectrum, right? So one of the initial kind of proponents of this idea was, in fact, one of the main architects of neoliberalism, Milton Friedman, right? Who argued that, at least for people who weren't able to work for themselves, we can introduce what he called a negative income tax. He also described it as dropping money from a helicopter, right, as a form of income support, right? On the other hand, people all the way on the left of the spectrum have also promoted basic income, right? It's been promoted, especially out of Silicon Valley, by people very much with a libertarian leaning, right? So as a result, some people have suggested that what's happening in the proposal of universal basic income is a replacement of the welfare state, right? Trying to get rid of other forms of support and replacing them with UBI, right? So you have skeptics like this, that universal basic income is intended to provide political cover for the elimination of social programs and the privatization of social services, right? That's explicitly what Milton Friedman and others have asked for, right? But other people have suggested that even if you start UBI with this intention, in fact, there's much more kind of radical potential that you unleash, right? So Eric Oldenwright is a committed socialist. This is from his book, How to Be an Anti-Capitalist in the 21st Century. And one of his main policy programs that he advocates is universal basic income. And he says that regardless of why you implement UBI, what you essentially do is you reunite workers with the means of subsistence, even though they remain separated from the means of production. As a result, UBI directly modifies the basic class relations of capitalism, right? You put much more power in the hands of workers by allowing them to kind of choose what kind of wage labor they want if they have a basic income floor, okay? So this kind of debate about how radical UBI is also still kind of at work in the same way as cash transfers, okay? Now, what's interesting in all of this kind of research and literature about cash transfers and UBI is the environment is very rarely mentioned, right? Very rarely are the environmental implications of UBI talked about, and very rarely is UBI attached to the idea of actually trying to encourage sustainability, right? And there's very few programs in practice that actually link up kind of poverty reduction with environmental protection, right? The closest one to doing this is a program called Bolsa Verde in Brazil that has produced some really interesting findings, but that one is, at least on its surface, a conditional cash transfer program as opposed to unconditional, right? So our idea, building on all of this, was what if we take these two worlds and we bring them together in a way that they haven't been done so far, right? To try to bring cash transfer into conservation finance, but also really to bring in a consideration for environmental protection into the provision of cash transfer, right? And so the composite instrument that we're envisioning as the basis of this is what we call a conservation basic income, which we define as, ideally at least, an unconditional cash transfer, self-consciously presented as a subsidy for sustainable rural livelihoods in conservation critical areas, okay? And as with cash transfers, the key question in the potential efficacy of this approach is this question of unconditionality, right? So we know from the literature on cash transfers, UBI pilots, right, that there's a lot of potential benefits for unconditionality. The first that people often talk about from a justice point of view is that avoids paternalism, right? In traditional development projects, outside development planners are the ones who kind of decide what's in local people's best interest. Unconditional support allows people to choose for themselves what they want to spend their money on. As a result, it promotes freedom and autonomy, right, of the recipients of this kind of report. From a practical perspective, it very much reduces bureaucracy, right? Because a lot of development aid is kind of funneled off by the development workers themselves and by bureaucracies. If you put money directly in people's hands, then in most organizations, what you're talking about is 80% of project funding can go directly to people, and only about 10% is actually needed for bureaucracy, which is very, very minimal in most traditional development work. Right? And as a result, it can be quite cost effective in terms of actually getting a bang for your buck in terms of poverty reduction, and a lot of evidence shows that unconditionality can have really positive benefits on social development and human well-being, right? But when you start thinking about this in relation to conservation, this key question becomes, can it also benefit conservation, right? If people aren't actively being compelled to use their money for conservation activities or being held responsible for conservation outcomes, okay? And so on one hand, there's a theory of change that builds on the kind of political ecology scholarship that I'm familiar with that suggests it can, right? If you assume that the majority of people who are using resources in unsustainable ways, especially around conservation areas that they're not supposed to be using the resources for, is because they're driven to by poverty, right? As a result, potentially having an alternative income source will allow them to choose to reduce their use of those resources, right? So kind of the theory of change underlying this approach is this, right? The provision of CBI will reduce poverty, right? As a result, it will also then change people's kind of perception or attitudes towards the conservation spaces that they're involved in, right? Very simplistic kind of model here. Obviously, things are much more complex, and the result of this, hopefully, in the end, will be enhanced ecosystem support without needing to kind of coerce people into doing specific activities, okay? But of course, as many people are skeptical about whether or not people will use their money productively in cash transfer programs, there's a lot of people who are also skeptical in relation to conservation, and these alternative potential that what people will use their money for is to buy equipment that actually allows them to extract resources even more efficiently than before, right? You buy a chainsaw and then you can cut down the forest even more, right? So in a sense, we're kind of in this space about, it becomes kind of an empirical question, right? And a design question in terms of, which kind of outcome we end up moving towards, okay? And this is the space we're in right now. We've kind of developed the conceptual work for doing conservation basic income, and now we're trying to move towards implementation, okay? And so we have a kind of growing network of organizations, some of which come from the basic income cash transfer world, some of which come from the conservation world, that are kind of coming together about trying to really define, implement, and then develop kind of rigorous monitoring and valuation around this approach, right? And so what we're envisioning then is kind of a three-phase process. The first is about starting conversations with people who are living in and around conservation areas about the potential efficacy of this approach and what type of things need to be taken into consideration in developing this. So we have NGOs working with communities in different parts of the world that are starting these conversations, right? And then also how it is that these interventions should be structured in relation to other interventions that are coming. This is also a big discussion in the basic income world, the so-called cash plus approach, right? Always wants to combine, other forms of intervention with cash transfer, and there's a question of, is this necessary, and if so, what should it look like? And then developing of pilot projects in order to facilitate learning, okay? And so there's a first project that's actually been underway for about a year already in Peru, okay? And they're starting to do the evaluation of that, so we should have some really interesting findings from that soon. And then me and my colleagues at Wageningen University have recently got some funding to implement a second project in Rwanda that we're just getting started right now, okay? And so in this place, this will take place in two different parts, right? There's two different national parks. There's 4 different national parks within Rwanda. We'll be working in 2 of these, right? In the south of the country is a park called Nyungwe, okay? It harbors chimpanzees. They're often used for tourist purposes and a variety of other kind of species, right? And in the north is an even more famous place called Volcanoes National Park. It's famous because within this park live mountain gorillas, right? And this was the site where Diane Fossey did her research and was killed, so it became kind of world famous as a site for this. Generates a huge amount of revenue through tourism coming in, right? Meanwhile, around both of these parks, live in some of the most densely populated areas of sub-Saharan Africa, right, with people living in fairly extreme poverty, right, who receive almost no benefit from the tourism that comes into the area, right. And what we're talking about is areas that look like this, right. This is the border of Volcanoes National Park. It's quite dramatic, right. Forest on the one side, right, agricultural fields on the other, right. So very poor farmers living right up to the border of this park, right. There's been attempts to distribute a bit of revenue from the park to people in the past, but it hasn't been very effective. And so what we're really positing is that this basic income support could be an alternative way of supporting communities in these spaces. Okay. And so in this project, we're working with an NGO called 100 Weeks that's based in the Netherlands, and we just developed a relationship with, that's been doing cash transfer programs not associated with conservation spaces in sub-Saharan Africa for quite a while. Okay. And so they have a particular approach that they use, which doesn't really fulfill all of the requirements of UBI, like no projects do, but it could be considered kind of a partial UBI. They specifically focus only on women. They have a particular theory for why they do this. In Rwanda, it's a specific level of poverty that's evaluated by the government. Poverty level 2, poverty level 1, people are supported through other programs, so they focus on this, right? It's equivalent of €8 per week for about 100 weeks, which is about 1/4 of the GDP per capita of the country, which is often the level that proponents of UBI suggest should be an income floor. All right, this is a cash plus approach in the sense that provision of cash is associated with the provision of trainings for financial management, some environmental awareness, but also the creation of village savings and loans associations so people can pool their resources. Right. The program is unconditional in the sense that there's no kind of requirement for what you spend their money on, but there is a limited conditionality in the sense that people involved in the program are required to come to these trainings. Right. So the idea is that this income will be provided to people around these two different national parks that we're working with, and we'll try to measure in an interdisciplinary way the socioeconomic impact of these payments, the biodiversity impact, and then also social dynamics that happen around them, including people's understanding about unconditionality and those kinds of things. And so we've hired 6 Rwandan PhD students who will ground that research. They're in the process of getting training right now. The organizations are trying to raise the money in order to do the implementation, which should hopefully start at the end of this year. Before that, hopefully we'll collect a lot of baseline data in these different domains and then see how things unfold over the next several years. Right? So that's an exciting project to be involved in. And in addition to that, I'll just go through that. I already mentioned that briefly. We're in conversation with groups in various parts of the world, right? As you can see here, about potentially also working on pilot projects, right? And we're working on a new grant application right now, which is going to be due in about 3 weeks. That would potentially combine 8 of these different sites within a similar kind of research framework, where conversations will start with local people about potential research design, and we'll try to kind of bring those insights together in this kind of international framework over the next couple of years. So a lot of exciting potential, but also a lot of still uncertainty and open questions about how this works, right? And potential negative implications of doing the same things as well, right? So a series of many open questions, and I'll leave you with this, right? How do you actually find the recipient community? What if people move into the area after the program has started? What do you do about that, right? What are the criteria for qualification, right? People who reside in the space. What about extended families? Are children also recipients of funding? These become kind of fundamental questions. What exactly is the appropriate level of funding? How's that determined, right? How do you fund this, right? That's, of course, a key question that some of our partners are wrestling with right now. Do you have the potential, as I mentioned, to actually create perverse incentives for increasing resource use, right? And how do you mitigate against that? Are you encouraging people to move in the area in order to receive these funds? This has been a concern for all development activities around conservation areas. Do they actually encourage kind of increased population pressure, right, on resources, right? And there's kind of a fundamental debate about whether or not providing income is the right thing to do, or whether that increases kind of market integration, or whether instead you should be focused on universal basic services, providing services, right? So is income the appropriate form of support, especially if we're thinking about indigenous communities that don't have a lot of market integration? will the provision of income, lead to a kind of unwanted social change? So these are just some of the questions that we're still wrestling with, and the idea is that these questions would be the basis for the conversations that happen at the ground level in terms of potential design, that people themselves would have a say kind of in shaping whether they want this kind of intervention, and if so, what would it look like. So as I mentioned, this work is just starting. We're hoping to continue it over the next several years. Work in progress, and really interested to hear your thoughts, but also concerns about this approach. So thank you very much. Okay.
Kind of questions were kind of coming up in my head there as well. You've put these open questions there, which of course are really interesting for us to get into. But I just wondered if there are any questions for Rob from the audience here in the room or online. So please feel free. Look forward to any questions. Yes, Olivia, please.
Thank you. Thanks so much for your presentation. It's really interesting approach. I'm not a conservation scholar. I study sustainable agriculture in the global north context, and I particularly focus on property relations and private ownership and how that influences the way people are producing food or doing rural activities. So I guess I was quite curious if you have done any research, or if the pilot projects that you're running, whether they are looking at like what the impacts of different like tenurial relations are on how the CBI works out. I'm thinking like of Tanya Lee's work on class differentiation and accumulation from below, and just wondering like how those different things would interact with each other, if that's something you thought about. Thank you.
Yeah, a really interesting question. Yeah, that's definitely one of the considerations we have, and I should have also said that we're never envisioning CBI as some kind of silver bullet that comes in and just radically transforms things. It's all about the context around it, and especially a big part of our convivial conservation approach is if you're only focusing on local conservation spaces rather than addressing these kind of larger, especially political economic forces and extractive industries that are always kind of impacting communities' ability to be autonomous, then you're we call it mopping the floor without closing the tap, right? So those are the kind of things that have to be addressed. And of course, dynamics, including local land tenure, will have huge impacts in all of these situations. And that's why it's really important for us, this kind of qualitative social dimension of the research that will go alongside the kind of typical socioeconomic perspective will be really important for really trying to understand those kind of contextual factors. And then also doing it within a really wider range of context. So we have sites on 4 different continents that are all quite different, and so hopefully we'll learn a lot through the kind of comparison about the challenges and conditions in these different sites. We have one colleague in this kind of broader network who's specifically trying to develop a basic income support for farmers in the UK right now, and trying to work on a pilot project for that as well. But I'm not sure how developed that is.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yes, Karen.
Thanks for a super interesting presentation. I also don't work on conservation, but I was interested in learning a bit more about how you're designing this new big comparative study, because it sounded like you are choosing projects in areas where you already have conservation projects. But wouldn't it also be important to look at areas where maybe local communities themselves are involved in planning conservation? Wouldn't that be important for understanding how this new approach towards conservation potentially could be very useful?
Definitely. And that is part of this larger project that we're envisioning, in the sense that some of the new sites that we're talking about are specifically lands that are managed and owned by communities. And in fact, I should mention this Peruvian project that's been underway for a year. That's exactly the situation right there. It's not a state-protected area. It's a community-owned forest. And that project is really interesting because it's been designed from the bottom up over a long period of time with an indigenous women's organization. But we don't have a lot of hard information about the impact of that yet. The Rwanda project is is more pragmatic in the sense. We had the opportunity to come into a project that was already kind of in development, and in this case it was specifically around these state managed protected areas. So we're taking advantage of the fact that there was an opportunity for there. For several years now, I needed something to study, right? But I'm not a developer, and I don't really have access to development funds, right? I have access to research funds. So, but I had the opportunity then. I was invited to kind of collaborate on this project, and then I was able to find the funding to do the research. So, so we're looking at that, but I would say that's far from our kind of ideal scenario if we're thinking about all the principles of convivial conservation. But hopefully, it will still provide some kind of compelling evidence that will help to test the potential of this approach. But there are lots of challenges, especially in the Rwandan context, that we're struggling with right now.
Great, thank you. Any questions online? Or there's a question here, the gentleman in the front, please.
Yeah, thank you. This was very interesting. I'm both biologist, a green politician, and UBI advocate.
Mm-hmm.
So I was thinking about you talk very well about universal or unconditional UBI, and I like that. But in a sense, when you also want to conserve the area around, then a sort of a condition as well. So so you can't get this all together. But I admit that some condition may be good, and there's several examples on that. And I don't know if the indigenous American indigenous with the casino drift making any conservation. But I mean, that's a good example on UBI that it's working and it's permanent.
Yeah, you raise a really good point, and one of our collaborators has really challenged us on this point that can a basic income that's linked with conservation ever actually be fully unconditional, right? Or is there some type of kind of implicit conditionality, even if you're not saying this? And people will come to their own conclusions about this. On the other hand, there is also compelling evidence from a lot of payment environmental services programs that are supposed to be conditional, but don't actually enforce their conditionality, right? That not having explicit or actually enforced conditionality can still have environmental benefits, right? So there's a possibility of some kind of intermediate approach where you don't have formal conditionality, but people kind of come to their own conclusions about the fact that their basic income is kind of associated with the conservation space. And so that's what we're really interested in this this qualitative research, to really understand people's own perception about what this payment is, where it's coming from, right, and whether or not they perceive it as conditional or unconditional, right, and how that influences the outcome. But this is this kind of a gray area, kind of open space that we're interested in exploring. Yeah. Yeah, potentially, and then there might also be the other dynamics that you're talking about, that help shape how the payments are used, right? So then it's also about understanding those conditions and how those conditions can also be shaped in such a way that the outcomes either fall in one way or the other. But that it is to a sense true, and there just hasn't been a lot of research about the environmental impacts of cash transfer programs in general, right? There's a few studies that about cash transfers, conditional and unconditional, that haven't been explicitly linked with environmental outcomes, and that do actually have environmental outcomes. And right now, the evidence is mixed, right? So some programs actually seem to have a positive impact on deforestation. Other programs have the reverse. And so then, I think it just calls for more kind of in-depth, fine-grained understanding of how these programs play out, and that's what we're trying to do now.
I think maybe was there a question online? Would
Hello.
you like to read that out?
We have a question from the chat. This is from Louis. He says, "Thank you very much for this presentation," and he sends greetings from Mexico. He'd like to ask if the CBI could have a positive or negative impact on peripheral communities that aren't receiving it. Could it affect regional economies or increase the extraction of the natural resources?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, so in an ideal world, right, everybody would have unconditional basic income everywhere, right? And if you had enough funding, then hopefully you could treat everybody everywhere within your conservation space, but in reality, when we're talking about pilot programs, we're talking about very limited, at least initial funding, and that the potential for leakage, right, is significant, right? People have new sources of revenue. Maybe they stop using resources locally, but maybe they just buy them from other communities that increase their resource use. So that's one of the things that we'll be definitely monitoring. Right? Yeah, I mean, it's true that all of these things have that kind of potential. There's also this real danger in terms of these types of approaches that you end up creating kind of tension both within communities, but also in between communities in terms of who receives funding and who doesn't. And there's been a lot of research about that, and a lot of mechanisms that organizations have been able to create that they think at least kind of mitigates that, because this isn't reinventing the wheel. These approaches have been tried for a long period of time. So yeah, we'll be trying to figure all of that out too.
Yeah, so I guess I had a question as well, if there's nothing else online or in the room, but I guess, so my experience with engaging with some of the mainstream conservation actors and funders is that there's this kind of juggernaut which is kind of going on all the time. It's like this massive cargo ship or train which is continuing current approaches, and as you kind of alluded to in your presentation, there's or directly said, actually not just alluded to, but there's this kind of, it's uncertain where the tipping point of the evidence kind of needs to reach for failure in order to sort of move on and say, okay, this isn't working, we need to figure out something else. So I wanted to ask you a little bit about the dynamics of the discussions that you're having with funders, and what are the kinds of questions they're asking around evidence, around argumentation, that type of thing. If you could give us maybe a few insights there.
Yeah, I mean, our sense in talking with conservation organizations is that within many organizations, they're kind of in a moment of crisis right now. And there's been a lot of kind of challenges to the mainstream approach coming from different directions. We need more protected areas, we need less protected areas, and we need more kind of focus on development. And organizations are caught in between. And they're also not monolithic, which is really interesting. And increasing what we see in the big organizations is kind of a growing divide between kind of the rank and file and the leadership, which has become part of this kind of transnational elite, right, and diplomats, and they kind of circulate throughout, right? Sometimes they're in conservation organizations, sometimes they're in UNEP, sometimes they're in the World Bank, right, and they kind of move throughout, and they have their own kind of networks and things, and people on the ground don't necessarily have a lot of influence on that. On the other hand, a lot of the things that people at the top say aren't necessarily reflected in practice underneath. So in a lot of organizations, we think there's kind of a groundswell of kind of thinking of this need to kind of move to a different approach, right? And we've talked to people about these different approaches, and they say, yeah, we're working on more integrated spaces. We have better governance arrangements, but we're really struggling with the finance. It's really the finance element that people are really having a hard time, kind of cracking. And then in thinking about the funding sources, yeah, the conversations we've had is basically people are looking for some type of compelling evidence that they can use to make the argument that there's enough promise and a little enough risk in this approach that at least it should be started. And that's the kind of piece that we're really struggling with, right? When people talk about compelling evidence, they want something really kind of hard, scientific, incredible, right? And then we start getting into what type of methodology results in that, right? And within the development community, and especially within the cash transfer community, that moves in the direction of randomized control trials, right? And that has all its own implications, right? But that is still often considered the gold standard within the development community, and there's increasing pressure. If you want to actually show the direct kind of biodiversity impact of your project, then some type of approach that resembles a randomized control trial might be the only thing that develops that evidence, and then it starts getting into these ethical questions about whether or not that need to generate the evidence then is enough to justify the potential ethical implications of doing that type of intervention. And we're really, really struggling with that as well, right? In what ways can we actually provide this evidence? We're trying to do it in three different ways, right? Through understanding a household's resource use and how that changes over time, understanding in a qualitative way people's perception of the environment and their relationship with it, but then also getting some hard kind of biodiversity data. And doing that in a small space and in a limited amount of time in a credible way is becoming one of the major challenges, and we're still trying to figure out what kind of methodology would work for that. But yeah, if we can figure that out, I think that might be the thing that helps push this over the top. Meanwhile, we're trying to organize to kind of push this approach at the international agenda. there's a space now in the World Conservation Congress that's coming up, organized by the IUCN, especially the commission that focuses on social and economic dynamics is trying to do an intervention there that they call reimagining conservation, and they've invited us to include a kind of presentation on this approach. So we're trying to also then kind of promote this, within this kind of discussion about how conservation will move forward at the global landscape as well. So on these various fronts, we're just trying to move this forward little by little and hope that eventually it starts snowballing.
Thank you very much. Are there any more questions? Maybe from, yes, please.
Hi. It's not a question, it's more of thinking something out loud. I am a PhD student working on conservation and displacement in India. And I was thinking about the part where you mentioned the question, which is, can it also benefit conservation? And then you mentioned how it would lead to poverty alleviation and then less resource use. But then I was thinking how resource use is not just material, and it's also social and very cultural, related to identity questions. And then, so a lot of conflict around resource use is also communities asserting themselves to show that we are connected to these spaces, and that we don't just need it for our material purpose. Of course, material is also there. There's a lot of resource for subsistence, but then also for rituals and other purposes, the rivers, the trees, and these spaces. So will this idea of benefit for conservation using conservation basic income incentivize conservation authorities, because conflicts are not going to stop, I feel, just because there is a basic income, and then but will it also legitimize conservation authorities removing such people from these spaces?
I hope that won't be the case, right? Because we think of this as being embedded with this broader approach of convivial conservation that also requires these other dynamics. And if those are promoted together, then hopefully they have a much more kind of holistic effect. And if somehow this was used as a justification for removing people from spaces and policing it off, then that would be contrary to everything that we're trying to promote there. There's always the danger that people will take an approach and use it in ways that you didn't intend and have it mean things you didn't intend. We're in discussions with people about the possibility, from their perspective, of linking up CBI with carbon markets, with biodiversity credits that we think are really potentially problematic. And I have yet to be convinced that there's a way you could do that in such a way that would actually be consistent with what we're trying to promote here. But I haven't, categorically said I don't think this will work yet. But that there's a lot of danger in that. On the other hand, for communities that have been previously excluded from areas, one of the ways we're thinking about this is as a form of reparations, right, for that kind of exclusion. If the alternative is just being excluded and having nothing, right? But ideally, right, we're talking about provision of income to people who still have access to resources within a space, right, but are trying to use them sustainably. For instance, in Peru, the big issue is that people need income, and they're always being kind of approached by logging companies and others who want to use their resources, right? And the provision of income then kind of allows them to not have to, kind of become susceptible to those things that they would choose not to be anyway. So that is kind of more of an ideal situation where people still have access to resources, but then provision of income then helps them to have an income source that potentially diminishes use of the resources. But all of this is very much context specific, and certainly CBI is not appropriate in any given situation. I did a talk at one point to a guy who was involved in the management of a park in the Democratic Republic of Congo that had tremendous amount of conflict around it, including mineral extraction. And it's like, yeah, the last thing you want to do is introduce something like CBI into a context that has so many security concerns, right? That would not be appropriate. There's many other things that are more important in that situation. And so it has to be seeing whether or not this is the right intervention in the space. Again, it's not universal, and it's not a silver bullet, but we think it can, in some cases at least, be a useful component of a more holistic approach.
Wonderful. So I think we're at time. So thank you very much, everyone, for the conversation and the questions. And please join me in thanking Rob for his talk. Very interesting to listen to. So
thank you all.
Thank you.